So in chapter 9, we have this very theme being developed by our Hebrews writer, who was very, very learned, by the way, this gentleman, whoever he was, very learned and a very good teacher. Now, even the first covenant, well, that tells you there was a second one by implication. The first covenant, the old covenant of Moses, was the first one. It had rules for divine service. God is highly organized. You know, if you created the universe as it is and you look at these extraordinary facts of nature all around us, the butterflies and the birds and the trees and so on, there's a tremendously well organized system at work there. But when it comes to religion, obviously then God ordained something of a divine service. I love the text, I'll just refer to it in Hebrews 1:14. It says that angels, what is their job? What is their job? They're sent out to minister to those who are heirs of the kingdom. There are angels on the job watching over the Christian and interfacing, interacting, and operating with God. So God is highly organized. Jesus, as representing God, he's the Messiah, the Son of God, is highly organized. So there was indeed, in the Old Testament time even, during the time of the first covenant with Moses, it had regulations, of course it did, of divine worship. It didn't just say, well, you just worship in any way you want or feel like. It had a regulated system to tell you how to do this. And it had an earthly sanctuary, a holy place that was on this earth. Now he explains what he means in verse 2. For there was indeed a tabernacle. That would be a sacred tent. The whole idea of religion is, how can we be sure where God is and where is he operating? How can we get in touch with God? Well, God chose to put his presence in a sacred tent. That was a mobile house, if you like. And God gave them one of those things to aid with their faith. And it had two parts to it. An outer part, verse 2, which is called the holy place, very sacred. And there, says our writer, and you can check this in the Old Testament, there was a lampstand. The lampstand, you remember in the book of Revelation, represents churches. Churches are supposed to be lampstands shining the light of the gospel of the kingdom to the whole world around them. So there was a lampstand, a table, and the sacred bread, the bread of the face, literally. This apparently was 12 loaves of bread, which were eaten by the priests too, and they represented the 12 tribes of Israel. So there was a very intricate, detailed, instructive, physical thing that you could look at to tell you about God and what he's doing. Now, behind the second veil, so there was a veil outside the first section, and then on the second section, there was also a veil. Behind that second veil, there was a tabernacle, a tent, a holy tent, which is called the Holy of Holies. So this was very special. That particular area behind the second veil was called the supremely holy place. Why? It had in it, verse 4, a golden, notice, altar of incense. Incense is a symbol of prayer. The prayers of God's people are heard in heaven and by God and Jesus themselves, and they're like incense, as though they're being wafted into the air for God to hear. So it had the golden altar of incense, I should say. It had the golden altar of incense and the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant. That was a box about 4 or 5 feet long, a box which had the words of the covenant in it, the 10 Commandments, the Old Covenant, overlaid on all sides with gold. Look at the gold. The point is, you're supposed to catch, or God is supposed to catch your absolute attention with these physical objects which represent God and his presence on earth. Now, in that ark, there was a golden, note the emphasis on gold here, golden jar holding the manna which had fed them in the wilderness, and holding Aaron's rod that actually budded. You go back and read the story. These are extraordinary witnesses to God's activity in Israel. And also in that ark were the stone tablets of the covenant. What were those? The list of the 10 commandments of the old covenant. Please note that all this has to do with the first covenant, not the second Christian covenant, not the covenant of the new covenant, but the covenant of the old. And above the ark, then, overshadowing it, were the cherubim of glory, a couple of angels overshadowing the mercy seat, where, as we're reading on, we'll find God extended his mercy, especially year by year. But then the writer says we can't deal with this in more detail now, but you can study it yourself. Lots of good commentary on this. So in verse 6, when these things had been prepared, organized, built, and set up in this way, the priests, that's to say the Aaronite people, you had to be a child or descendant of Aaron, a Levitical priest, those priests were continually going into that outer temple, the first one, outer tabernacle. It was a sacred tent, as we remarked, and they went there performing the services day after day after day. There were sacrifices to be offered every day. Fascinating to me that God really goes to a great deal of length to give us something to think about, something to look at, something to contemplate and learn from. And in verse 7, into the second temple, the Holy of Holies, that is, not just the holy place, which is the first section, but the Holy of Holies, the high priest goes alone. The high priest, not just any priest, but the high priest goes alone on his own, once only per year on the Day of Atonement. And he doesn't go in there without blood. There's a tremendous amount of blood involved in this system. We might ask, why does God then stress blood so much? The answer would be found, I think, in Leviticus 17:11, which says that the life of a person is in the blood. So blood then symbolizes life. We're all interested in life. Some of us are getting older, and we're more interested in life, I think, than ever. So blood is the symbol of life, because if you lose your blood, you lose your life. Blood is keeping life going, keeping you ticking all the days of your mortal life. And then it says in verse 7 that that high priest offered that blood for himself. He was a sinner too. He offered that blood to cover his own sins and for the sins of the people done in ignorance. As a nation, the whole of the group of Israelites had been guilty of sin. So the blood was offered on their behalf. And this is a symbol, a picture of that time when gifts and sacrifices were offered, which could not make the worshipper perfect in conscience. That's an interesting distinction. None of that very elaborate and detailed offering of blood sacrifices could give a perfect conscience to those for whom it was offered. Yes, it gave a temporary relief. The idea of forgiveness was fine, but it wasn't an ultimate way of dispensing with sin. Consisted in verse 10 only food and drink and various washings, physical rules imposed on those people of Israel until, please note, until, and not after, but until a time of Reformation. Talk about the word Reformation a moment. We all know about the Protestant Reformation with Luther and Calvin, but did you know there was a time of reformation in biblical faith? And that Reformation happened when that form of worship, the temple worship with all of its sacrificial detail, became irrelevant. Now we're speaking to some of our friends out there who still think that you have to keep the Sabbath and the holy days and the food laws, but you're not thinking of the right covenant if you're doing that. So the Reformation has now taken place. The Reformation with a capital R. There's a new system now introduced by the new high priest, who is not Moses, but the new Moses, a brand new system of teaching, which we should call Christianity. Jesus, as somebody said rightly, was the first preacher of his own gospel. Wow. Yes, Jesus was the first preacher. John the Baptist, of course, preceded him slightly, but leaving John the Baptist's detail out for the moment, Jesus was the first preacher of the gospel. Very important for you to believe that. The gospel does not, I repeat, not begin with Paul. Paul certainly develops the gospel and brings truths which had not been heard before. That's absolutely true. But Paul did not invent the gospel. The gospel began, as Hebrews 2:3 says, with the beginning of the speaking of Jesus. And that same verse in Hebrews 2:3, which is a refrigerator verse big time, that same verse says that it was confirmed to the writer of the Hebrews, whoever he was, it was confirmed by the miracles that those people did. So that then bears on what Michelle was saying. There were miraculous things going on in New Testament times which are not going on in the same way now. So here we have it then in verse 11. Now Messiah has appeared. Very important verse. Hebrews 7:11, 9:11. No, 9:11. There's a good memory key for you. 9:11. You all remember 9:11. Well, 9:11 of Hebrews says that the Messiah appeared, came on the scene, not just when he died, but he came on the scene and then died. So he appeared as the preacher of his own gospel. And what did he preach about? The good things to come. Jesus' message is about the future kingdom of God. And Jesus then entered through the greater and more perfect tabernacle or tent, not one made with hands in the days of Moses. That's to say, not of this present creation. In other words, it's of the new creation. So Jesus is a whole level higher than Moses. He's replaced Moses. By no means should you get stuck in the law of Moses in the letter, because that's defunct, that's obsolete. You're barking up the wrong tree if you think you have to observe the law of Moses in the letter. Jesus then entered in verse 12, once and for all, finally, only once and never to be repeated, into the true holy place, which is now in heaven, of course, with God, not using the blood of goats and calves, as they did in the Old Testament time, but through his own blood, his own life. And by offering himself his own blood or life, he secured the redemption related to the age to come. I've translated that deliberately. Aionios in Greek means to do with the age to come, and the age to come is the future kingdom of God. That's how the story goes. So redemption means buying back a ransom, if you like, not paying the devil a ransom, as some have wrongly said, nothing to do with paying a ransom to the devil, but a buying back from sin, if you like, a buying back from the sin that we all are involved in, and it's related to the kingdom of God and how you enter it. Now, he goes on very logically in 13. If the blood of goats and bulls under the Levitical system and the ashes of a heifer, sprinkling those who have been defiled, if they could consecrate, if the blood of goats and the ashes of the heifer, sprinkling those who have been defiled, consecrate for the purity of the body, they did give you a purification of your physical body. How much more? That's a typical Jewish way of arguing. How much more will the blood of Messiah, who through the spirit of the age to come, same translation, age to come, the spirit, which is the spirit of God, the spirit of Christ, which we Christians have, is to do with the kingdom, the age to come. How much more will the blood and life of Messiah, who through the spirit of the age to come offered himself without defect? He was a sinless offering. Isn't that amazing? Jesus never sinned, as Michelle was telling us earlier. He never lied. He offered himself as the ultimate lamb, the spotless lamb. All of that, of course, is found in Isaiah 53 as well, as you know. You can read about it there. How much more that spotless lamb and his offering of himself can purify our consciences. Purify our conscience. We don't have to have an evil conscience. We don't have to despair over our own sin or keep remembering it, because our conscience is also by baptism. The same thing is said of baptism in Peter, that will purify our conscience from dead works, all those works that we performed before we were true believers, to serve the living God. Doesn't get any better than that. Now look at 15. For this reason, note the tightness of the argument here. Jesus is the mediator of a new covenant. I hope that's clear to you. Jesus, I repeat, is the mediator not of the old covenant, of the new covenant. If you've been writing, some of you have, even Unitarians, that Jesus really just mediated the old covenant, copied the old covenant, you are absolutely fundamentally wrong. You need to take a good look at that and compare it with 15:1. Jesus is the mediator of a new covenant. And I would add here, Paul of himself, Paul said that he was a mediator of the new covenant. That's a blessed simplicity. That's said in 2 Corinthians somewhere, that Paul himself was the mediator of the new, the renewed, not just renewed, but new covenant, which was not like the old one. The result is that those who have been called as Christians may receive the promise of the inheritance of the age to come. There's your whole Christian destiny. If you grasp that, what is this promise of inheriting the age to come? Well, let me remind you of what Abraham was promised. So this verse is always close to you when you're explaining this to your friends. It says that Abraham believed the gospel. It says that Abraham was given a promise that he would be heir of the world. What? Yes, heir of the world. That same promise then was inherited by Jesus, who is indeed heir of the entire world. In other words, let me put it to you this way. This may be a little shocking. If you're heir of the world, you're going to govern the planet, not just 5 or 10 cities, but govern the planet. That's what was promised to Abraham, was promised to Jesus, and promised now to the saints. Okay, let's go back. Can we have that big on the screen again? Thank you so much. Wonderful. Isn't that amazing? Promise of the age to come. And back in verse 15, since a death, the death of Jesus, has taken place for the redemption, the cancelling of the violations committed under the first covenant. Surely you can see there are two covenants here and they're not the same. Verse 16. Now, where there's a will, and here the word will, I think, is deliberate. The word covenant can also mean a will. In these particular verses, will is more appropriate. Where there's a will, there must be proven by the death of the one who made that will. For a will is valid at death, and it's never enforced while the one who made it lives. That's right. We're not talking so much about covenant here as a will, because the ethiki, the Greek word for covenant, has both meanings. Now, many of the translators get this right. A will is valid at death. So we had to have the death of Jesus shedding his blood to ratify the content of the covenant. I hope you're asking the question, what is the content of that covenant? I asked that of our Unitarian friends about a year ago, and I get a blank answer. Nobody seemed to know. What? The covenant is the covenant of the kingdom of God. You can show your friends that from Luke 22:29. Well, I'll give you a little secret about the Greek there, which is missing in many translations, not all. In Luke 22:29, Jesus said at the Lord's Supper, at that annual Passover, so to speak, the Lord's Supper, he said, I covenant to give you a kingdom. Most translations are weak there. They simply have, I appoint to you, as my Father appointed to me, a kingdom. Actually, the word there is covenant. There are some translations that get that right. I covenant to give you a kingdom. The word is covenant there. Most important. We'll find translations. Englishman's Concordance is not one that shows that, but it's very clearly, I covenant to you, as my Father covenanted to me to give me a kingdom. You see then that the kingdom of God gospel is the content of the whole new covenant. I wonder if you've wondered, why do we have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? Why have we got 4 accounts of the teaching of Jesus, the gospel teaching of Jesus? Because it's so important. And yet many Christians have not seen this yet. So in verse 18, even the first covenant, that's the Mosaic covenant, was inaugurated with blood, as we saw. Now look at this in 19, when every commandment had been spoken by Moses, there's the content of that covenant, all the words of the covenant, when they had been given by Moses, spoken by Moses to all the people according to the Torah, the law. Moses took the blood of calves and goats, water and scarlet wool, hyssop, and sprinkled the book of the covenant, that is, which contained the content of the old covenant, and sprinkled all the people. A lot of blood around, wasn't there? And Moses then said, this is the blood of the covenant, the contract which God commanded you. And the same way he sprinkled both the tabernacle, that's God's mobile tent, and all the vessels of ministry with blood. According to the Torah of Moses, nearly everything is purified with blood. And without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness. And I've suggested to you that blood is the symbol of life. And so when we're talking about life and death and blood, we're talking ultimate issues, as we are here. 23 says, it was necessary, divinely necessary, therefore, for the sketches, that would be the outlines, the rough outline of the things in heaven, all of that stuff that you could see on the earth in the time of Moses, the tabernacle, the sacred tent, and so on. These were mere outlines, shadows, rough copies of the real things in heaven. And the things in heaven, the ultimate forgiveness had to be purified with these sacrifices. That's to say, the heavenly things. Let me get that quite clear in 23. It was necessary, therefore, for the sketches, the outlines, the rough outlines of things in heaven to be purified with those Old Testament sacrifices. But the heavenly kingdom things, if you like, required a better sacrifice than these. And guess what that was? The sacrifice of Jesus. So you see the comparison. For Messiah did not, underline not, enter a holy place, a tent made by human hands, which is a sketch of the true one. You see, those things on the earth were sketches, rough outlines, shadows of the true ones, but not the true thing itself. So now Jesus, and here's the triumphant point in the argument here, has now entered heaven itself. He did at the ascension. Now, currently, today, as we speak, to appear in the presence of the one God for us. Isn't that triumphant? All of that Mosaic stuff then is passé, finished, decrepit, done away with. But the true Messiah and his gospel of the kingdom live on, of course. 25 says this, confirming the argument. He did not need to offer himself often. Jesus did not. In the way that the high priest in the Old Testament time enters the holy place, the high priest, singular, high priest enters the holy place year after year with blood not his own. That was the Day of Atonement. The high priest had to go year after year, annually. But Jesus didn't have to do that. For if he did, verse 26, then Jesus would have had to suffer often since the foundation of the world. But now, note the contrast, but now, once at the end of the ages, that's to say, the end of the Old Testament ages and the beginning of the New Age, where we're looking forward to the kingdom, the mixing or mingling or overlapping of ages, one might say, he has been revealed, Jesus has revealed, appeared as high priest to put away sin, to do away with sin, to cancel sin by the sacrifice of himself. So we believe in the substitutionary sacrifice of Jesus. In Mark 10:45, Jesus said, or Mark wrote there, that Jesus gave himself in our place. I wouldn't use the term necessarily just substitutionary is fine. There is a sense in which Jesus substituted for us. He died for us so we don't have to die. I wouldn't call it necessarily penal substitute, the idea that God sort of took it out on Jesus so he didn't have to take it out on us. I don't think that's necessary. But substitutionary atonement is certainly there. Jesus died in our place. And just as it's appointed, verse 27, for people to die once, how true that is. And after this, then, the next second of your consciousness comes judgment. So, in the same way, Messiah also, having been offered once, only once, finally, to bear the sins of many, will appear a second time. That's a very, very rare appearance of the second coming idea. The New Testament speaks of the parousia of Jesus very often, meaning his appearance, his second coming. Not second presence, by the way, as misleadingly taught by Jehovah's Witnesses. It's not a second presence. It's a second coming, a second arrival, showing up. And there it is in very plain terms in Hebrews 9:27. He will appear a second time at the parousia, not to bear sin, not to die for sin. Of course not. All that's been done. But to bring salvation. Wow, that's a powerful word. What is salvation? To those who are eagerly waiting for him. I would ask you to turn to Mark. Joseph of Arimathea is a prominent member of the council. He was a leading Jew who himself was waiting for the kingdom of God.